Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Hafiz, and I'm a librarian and professional services governor here at the University of Westminster. Tonight, I'm hosting this interview on behalf of the Black History Year Steering Group at the University of Westminster. And I am delighted to be here with Dr. Carlette Norwood to discuss historical racial trauma, a roadmap from the past, in the present, and towards the future. Dr. Norwood holds a PhD from the University of Birmingham, Edgbaston, and specialises in racial microaggressions and historical racial trauma. She has delivered workshops and webinars across the UK on varying topics within the framework of historical racial trauma, racial battle fatigue, and anti-racism training. Dr. Norwood will talk. You can ask any questions you have in the chat, and there will be some time for these questions to be answered in the Q&A session after Dr. Norwood finishes. Please note, this event is a safe and secure space for speakers and attendees, and any offensive comments are not welcome and will not be tolerated. So, on behalf of the Black History Year Steering Group here at the University of Westminster, we welcome Dr. Carlette Norwood.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. Before we start, I'd like to give a special thank you shout out to Reader Dr. Deborah Husbands, Black History Year Program Manager Paula Cadenhead, and to you, Sarah Hafiz, at the University of Westminster, for inviting me to speak this evening on behalf of Black History Month. It's a very exciting time for me because I've been able to present for Black History 3 times this year. It makes me feel like we should be celebrating Black history every month. So I'd just like to let you know that tonight my presentation will be a combination of lecture and reflection. It will contain elements of my research, and I will be sharing some of my lived experiences. I have notes that I will be reading from, but I'm hoping that the conversation will also grow organically once I finish speaking. I'm going to speak for roughly 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and answers afterwards. So please add your comments to the chat. I will be speaking largely from my doctoral thesis, which specifically contextualizes racism with Black women. So this is why you will hear me speak of Black women and not Black people generally. However, there's usually some crossover in different genders and ethnicities. So you'll see and hear about similar commonalities. There's a plethora of data and research as it relates to Black men, but there is a significant gap in the literature about Black women. So in observance of the theme for Black History Month, saluting our sisters, especially here in the UK, I would like to dedicate this presentation to all the Black women that are out there listening, who will listen, and even though they don't know this is going on, it's still dedicated to them as well. Throughout this presentation, I will be using history fluidly, both as the historic past in the historic distant past, and recent history within the lifespan. I'm not a historian, I'm a sociologist, but the two disciplines are so closely related. And I found in writing my thesis that I had to go back to the past to talk about the present to hopefully plan for the future. So history is almost a character throughout this presentation that manifested in my thesis. I wasn't quite aware that that was going to happen, but history is so interesting. And perhaps you've heard of that, unless you learn from history, you're destined to repeat it. So I think sometimes going back to look at where we came from, where we are, can help develop where we go in the future. So I first became interested in trauma and how it affects the body in April of 1995, when American Timothy McVeigh drove a truck carrying a massive homemade bomb into a US federal building, where it exploded upon impact. A total of 168 people were killed that day, including 19 children, and more than 500 were injured. 2 police officers were the first to arrive on the scene, so they saw the gravity of the situation, the intense destruction, the mangled bodies of children. And a news crew decided to follow these two officers as their life went on to see how first responders react to seeing such atrocities. So it was really interesting because one of the officers actually ended up becoming a petty thief himself and ended up in jail. And the other police officer killed himself. He committed suicide. So that really interested me in how experiencing something like that can affect the lives of seemingly normal people. So then it was almost exactly 10 years later, in August of 2005, Category 5 Hurricane Katrina hit the city of New Orleans and particularly devastated the predominantly Black area of the Ninth Ward, an area closest to the levees that were ill repaired, which should have prevented the waters from flooding the city. Structural engineers had warned that the levees would not hold a storm stronger than a Category 3. However, their pleas went unanswered and tragedy occurred, resulting in 1,836 fatalities and an estimation between 97.4 billion and 145.5 billion worth of structural damage. All three levels of government epically failed the citizens of the Ninth Ward, primarily due to the lack of concern and care for the Black citizens of New Orleans. I wrote my master's thesis on Hurricane Katrina and the devastation among the Black community in its aftermath. And I would love to talk about that more in depth with you, but I need to move on to why we're here today. But those two events helped develop my curiosity into how trauma manifests in people and how they recover, if they ever do recover, from traumatic events and experiences. Before moving to the UK, I had no idea about the racial climate in this country. Admittedly, I was extremely naive. All I really knew was that I enjoyed watching period pieces like Downton Abbey and listening to the beautiful British accent. When I first arrived, everyone sounded exactly the same, but now, fortunately, I can distinguish different accents. I picked up on some slang and have learned to understand the very stark cultural differences in this country. It had completely skipped my mind that the British were the leaders of the largest human trafficking movement in the history of mankind. I forgot completely how they colonized every continent on the planet and reaped enormous, incredible, astronomical wealth off the blood, sweat, and tears of primarily people of color around the world. Why? Why didn't I think of any of that when I packed my suitcases and my daughter and I flew across the Atlantic for 8 hours to begin new lives here? I'm going to come back to that question in just a little bit. I actually was glad to get away from the US because I had decided that I could not live in a country where Donald Trump was the president. That was the final straw. There was a burning in my heart and soul that I knew that the beginning of the end was at hand for America if he ever got the reins of power. Ironically, though, I ignored the fact that I was running right into the arms of his seemingly brother from another mother, Boris Johnson. No, in my mind, I was running to fish and chips, to an accent that delighted my ear, to a country of mystery and intrigue, home to Henry VIII, Shakespeare, and Idris Elba. I came to the UK for my PhD research, and little did I know just how much I would learn when I first began the journey. I didn't know much about Black British people, and admittedly, I didn't really put much thought into it until I began my doctoral study, which is an interdisciplinary study that combines elements of sociology, critical race theory, psychology, history, and the study of complex systems. My study builds upon the theoretical frameworks of the historical trauma theory, microaggression theory, and everyday racism theory. It interconnects them through the lens of Black women. It is a bilateral, qualitative, comparative study that explores the similarities and differences in which Black American women and Black British women experience and process racism and racial trauma. My study links slavery as the commonality between Black Americans, Black British, and Black Caribbean. It is the historical traumatic event that links primary generations of Black Americans and Black British of African descent and Caribbean descent. Slavery and all its components of racism are the commonality and social phenomena that create a causal relationship between Black Americans and Black British. A robust thematic analysis of my research revealed a substantial historical framework upon which a richer and deeper understanding of participants' experiences of racism were formed during childhood, and insight into how participants were affected by racial trauma throughout their lives. Participant narratives provide a provocative insight into their experiences and answer the research questions. A key and surprising finding of my study is that participants from the United States and Britain share more similarities than differences in the ways in which they experience racism and racial trauma. And I need to interject here and also add that I've been here 7 years and I still don't know when to use England, Britain, and the UK. So I use them interchangeably, and hopefully, you'll give me a pass on that if I use it incorrectly. So for example, women in both countries recalled racist experiences from early childhood being prominent and central in forming their understanding of how racism impacts their lives then and now. My findings show they reconciled similar events during childhood, irrespective of relevant demographical factors such as socioeconomics, marital status, or education. Locations where racial incidents occurred were also similarly listed in order of frequency, for example, school, work, and in shops. Women in both countries discussed having similar emotive responses following a racial incident, from anger to humiliation. So what exactly is historical trauma? Braveheart conceptualized historical trauma theory in 1998 in relation to the Nayan people, who are the native Indian Alaska Natives. In 2006, Braveheart and Sotero theorized that populations who have suffered a primary traumatic event can pass down the residual effects of that event intergenerationally. Historical trauma theory has been applied in previous studies regarding survivors of the Holocaust. However, Braveheart and Sotero's groundbreaking work was the first of its kind because the theory was applied to people of color. In her 2006 article, A Conceptual Model of Historical Trauma, Implications for Public Health Practice and Research, Michelle Sotero writes that the premise for this theory is that populations historically subjected to long-term mass trauma, such as colonialism, slavery, war, or genocide, exhibit a higher prevalence of disease even several generations after the original trauma occurred. Historical trauma theory broadly explicates on a macro level how psychosocial stressors have a profound influence on the manifestations of comorbid diseases and health inequities, how political, economic, and structural power relations influence class inequality, and how past and present influences affect life course factors in disease causation. In other words, historical trauma theory provides a macro-level temporal framework for examining how the life course of a population exposed to trauma at a particular point in time compares with that of unexposed populations. Based on a review of the literature, at least 4 distinct assumptions underpin this theory: that mass trauma is deliberately and systemically inflicted upon a population by a subjugating dominant population. Trauma is not limited to a single catastrophic event, but continues over an extended period of time. Traumatic events reverberate throughout the population, creating a universal experience of trauma, and the magnitude of the trauma experience derails the population from its natural, projected historical course, resulting in a legacy of physical, psychological, social, and economic disparities that persist across generations. The 3 basic constructs of the theory are that historical trauma theory, the historical trauma response, and the intergenerational transmission of historical trauma. As I mentioned in my research, the institution of slavery serves as the foundation and commonality that links Black Americans and Black British of African descent and Caribbean descent. Slavery in this context is the beginning of the journey, the preface of the legacy, the struggle of Black women that is still prevalent today. The paradigms of threat, abuse, sexual mistreatment, mistrust, and emotional trauma linger in contemporary Black women and their overall perceptions of white people in general. So let's take a look at history and its background. Before colonization, during the 15th century, race was only indicated by familial lineage or a continental distribution of people. There was no consideration of separate races or people unified as a race. People were categorized as Christian or heathen, and gender roles existed. After colonization, people were described by appearance, traits, and ways of life. Unfamiliar culture of family, community, worship, and celebration. Those outside of the European norm were considered heathens, savages, and beasts, and considered morally, spiritually, and cognitively inferior. In the late 16th century and early 17th century, the Africans arrived and settled in England on their own accord. Perhaps by coincidence, the first major example of British institutionalized racism toward its Black citizenry came in 1956 from Queen Victoria, who strongly and publicly disapproved of the presence of Africans in England. However, despite disapproval from the Queen, Black populations continued to grow throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. And Christian writer claims that Black people were viewed as a menace to white British society, which was fast establishing itself as Great Britain. Racial theories that systematically espoused the notion of white supremacy gained momentum and popularity. The landscape and infrastructure of Britain and its consumerism changed and grew exponentially because of the lucrative transatlantic slave trade. Part of Britain's consumerism became the African slaves themselves. In total, 5,000 slave voyages were made from Liverpool, carrying approximately 1.5 Africans into slavery. London and Bristol boasted the most profits earned from the slave trade in the early 1700s. However, by 1740s, Liverpool merchants had overtaken them, and eventually Liverpool's profits from the slave trade turned it into the wealthiest and most important city in Britain. By 1750, Liverpool was sending more slave ships to Africa and the Americas than London and Bristol combined, and continued to do so until the abolition of slavery in 1807. Even though Africans were not enslaved in Britain as they were throughout the Americas and the Caribbean, Britain's role in the slave trade is discussed in my thesis to contextualize the link between Black Americans and Black British. So let's go back to my previous question. Why? Why didn't I think of any of that when I packed my suitcases? I'll come back to that again. My studies participants, 32 women across both countries, particularly those of Caribbean descent in England, described their feelings of what they called England's false projection to the rest of the world that racism does not exist in England. Despite England's progressive movement toward the abolition of slavery, which it readily accepts credit for, the involvement of Britain's role in the transatlantic slave trade is often downplayed, for which some of my participants expressed discontent and anger. W.E.B. Du Bois was the first Black American to earn a PhD from Harvard University. He dedicated his life to the study of racism and coined the phrase double consciousness. He described how, in addition to life's normal stressors, Black people suffer added stress simply from being Black, and there are systems in place to perpetuate the oppression of Black people. In order to provide better clarity and understanding, let's talk about microaggressions for a few minutes. There's a lot of talk, confusions, and misconceptions about microaggressions generally, and there are different types of microaggressions. So let's explore that from the beginning. It should be noted that Chester Pierce contextualized the less obvious, more subtle forms of racism in opposition of his previous references to macroaggressions in 1970, and coined the term microaggressions. Pierce used the term to describe ways that Black people specifically were racially abused by white people in subtle, stunning, often automatic, and nonverbal daily exchanges, which are put downs and send denigrating messages to Black people. Current definitions, however, of microaggressions have expanded far outside the parameter of the original definition to now include other marginalized and disenfranchised races and ethnic groups. The term everyday racism was conceptualized in 1984 by Philomena Assed, a Dutch PhD researcher who pioneered a study in which she attempted to shift the micro-interactional perspective on racism to a macro-structural perspective. However, there is a significant gap in the literature that relates to everyday racism. Therefore, I relied heavily upon the only peer-reviewed article for clarity and better understanding of the theory. ERT is an important theoretical framework because it expands the understanding of how and why racism is experienced every day. Assed argues that ERT distinguishes and separates itself from other forms of racism because Black people encounter racism every day, meaning repetitively and with intimate familiarity. Scholars and critics disagree whether theorizing every day is even possible. However, Assed uses every day to starkly contrast non-everydayness. Some researchers describe everyday life as general societal commonalities and social norms. However, Assed's primary position argues that Black people experience racism every day as compared to white people's non-everydayness, non-existent experiences of racism. ERT can therefore be explained or interpreted as being the pioneer study for microaggressions as experienced by Black women specifically. Daryl Wing Sue calls microaggressions death by 1,000 cuts, meaning that the pain from microaggressions occur not as a fatal blow, but as a slow, frequent daily occurrence. So there are basically three types of microaggressions. The first one is microassaults, and those are the overt, deliberate, conscious, and explicit racial, verbal, or psychological attack. There's absolutely no mistaking when you have experienced a microassault. A micro-insult is a verbal or nonverbal or environmental insensitivity that directly demeans a person's racial identity or heritage. I'll give you an example. So if someone says, you're a credit to your race, or you're Chinese, so you must be good in maths, or if you're Black, you dance well in like rap music. Those are examples of micro insults. And then micro validations. Those are actions that exclude, negate, or nullify the psychological thoughts, feelings, or experiences of non-white individuals. Micro invalidations occur when a person who has never had racist experiences denies, disavows, marginalizes, or refutes people's lived experiences with their own narrow opinion or perspective. So for an example, if a white person hears a Black person complain about a racist experience and responds to something like, oh, I don't think that was racist at all, or you blame everything on racism, that's an example of a micro invalidation. Lawrence Davies of Equal Justice here in the UK states that 1 million microaggressive events occur in the workplace every year. That's 1 million microaggressive events occur in the workplace every year. That equals 8 microaggressive events every working minute. This is what is meant by death by 1,000 cuts. So let's go back to my question again. Why? Seemingly, the answer is because Britain is an expert in consistently presenting itself as being anything but racist. There is a mask firmly in place that suggests racism isn't as big of a deal here in Britain as it is in America. Oh, but it is. Americans just air their dirty laundry to the world. I can't tell you how many Amazon drivers, Uber drivers, people working in shops, bartenders, servers, etc., all ask me the same question. Which is worse, America or the UK? As though there is a quantitative measure for such a thing, or there's a competition of who's more racist. But we could just look at the term BAME as an example. The term BAME is a microaggression in and of itself, and some of us cringe every time the word is used. I had never in my life heard of BAME until I came to this country. BAME. So you just throw everyone who's not white under one big umbrella. But hold on, some white people fall into that category too. So, okay, I digress. My analysis found that despite differences in demographical information, age, education, socioeconomic status, marital status, or location, experiences of racism and the participants' reactions to it and their experiences of racism varied very little. Participants often similarly describe their experiences, emotions, reflections, reactions, and lessons learned, despite their geographical location or racial or ethnic background, as being eerily similar. It's also very important to note here, there is a massive anti-racism infrastructure in the United States that consists of societies, committees, organizations, legal aid, and others that are dedicated to fighting inequality, discrimination, and racism. Another consideration is that the United States population size is significantly larger than that of England. Currently, according to the US Census Bureau, Black people comprise 13.4% of the US population, of which Black women account for 12.9% of the overall population of women in the US. The exorbitant number of resources, many of them free, including legal services dedicated to fighting racism and racial discrimination, might explain why cultural and societal differences of how racism is confronted in the birth country and how they may play a part in how women in each country respond to racist activity, despite sharing the same experience. Women born in Black majority societies and later migrated to the UK have similar experiences of racism as their counterparts. However, overall, their experiences occurred later than women born into white majority societies, but were similar to the other women. As mentioned previously, a comparative level of services in the UK as they relate specifically to Black women couldn't be found. It can be argued that the structuring and classification of the UK census is problematic, therefore making data gathering amongst specific races and ethnicity almost futile. I'll speak more about that in a moment. British women frequently expressed frustration when trying to determine whether they had been a victim of racism or whether they had misinterpreted the event. They explained that racism in England can be so subtle, so insidious in nature, that it can leave them feeling sure but unsure about what had occurred. So it can leave them feeling, yeah, sure, that really happened, but did it really happen about what had occurred? Additionally, throughout their narratives, British participants drew similar conclusions about white British as rejecting the existence of racism in England. They added, however, that simultaneously, white British are often perceived as content in accusing other countries, especially and foremost the United States, as being racist, and that they are not. Participants describe a disconnect among white British who fail to understand that racism is embedded within the principles of colonialism. The majority of women in my study had eerily similar experiences. Generally, participants often describe similar racial incidents and comparable reactions to them. The similarities resonated and were especially compelling because the women didn't know each other, had never met, and had lived in the United States and England, respectively. There were several instances of déjà vu when narratives from different participants were markedly similar, often using the same words or phrases. My study found that women in both countries had similarities in the ways they experienced racism and very few differences. Participants recalled experiencing racism for the first time around the same age, which was age 6, and in the same places. They had similar experiences at school and work, generally under similar circumstances. Participants also received similar feedback and responses when they confronted those who had committed overt and covert racial discrimination or microaggressions. Participants' emotive responses ranged from anger and physical assault to confusion, exasperation, and anxiety, irrespective of country of origin or residence. However, all participants expressed some sort of reaction or emotive response to the event itself. The majority of participants turned to other Black women for comfort, support, and solidarity in navigating through white spaces and in contexts where racism and gender intersected. Generally, the majority of participants expressed sentiments of high distrust, discomfort, and dislike for white women specifically, with the exceptions of 2 participants whose mothers are white. Women across both countries described how childhood experiences of racial abuse sometimes resulted in being distracted in class, development of mistrust of teachers and administrators, loss of concentration, disinterest in school subjects, and lack of wanting to interact with white children because of microaggressive incidents. There was frequent discussion describing teachers as the perpetuators of racism, leaving the participant feeling isolated and alone, with no one within the school with whom to share racist incidents, or worse, no one who would take action. Black girls and women often experience marginalization, yet research has largely failed to focus on this intersectional group. According to Evans, Winters, and Esposito, 2010, the focus of research is almost exclusively on Black males and white females, and is rarely centered upon the unique experiences and needs of Black women. Participants also described how flashbacks and reflections upon past experiences of racial abuse that occurred during childhood still trigger emotive responses such as anger, discontent, depression, homelessness, and sadness. So what I'd like to focus on now is the micro-invalidation form of microaggressions. Micro-invalidations are the most subtle racial microaggressions. Sorry, let me say that again. The most subtle racial microaggressions are brief, commonplace, daily, verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults to the target person or group. Micro-invalidations are the most insidious form of microaggressions because they are most often are undetected and go completely hidden. The perpetrator almost never realizes they are doing something harmful. It is an intentional or unintentional form of gaslighting. It causes self-doubt, second-guessing, confusion, frustration, anger, dehumanization, depression, anxiety, feelings of isolation, and even considering ending life. Hypervigilance, survival mode, adrenal fatigue are caused by constant justification of sheer existence and experiences. It is an invalidation of legitimate emotions and labeling, including reactions to anger and labels such as angry Black woman. The most insidious form of micro-invalidation is called whataboutism, which arises frequently during conversation about racism. I'm sure you've seen this played out on social media a lot. Whataboutism came about in 1978 and is defined as the technique or practice of responding to an accusation or difficult question by making a counter-accusation or raising a different issue. Whataboutism occurs when criticism is twisted back on the initial critic. Whataboutery is defined as the logical fallacy that attempts to discredit an opponent's position by charging them with hypocrisy without directly refuting or disapproving their argument. Social media is a breeding ground for whataboutery. However, it can occur during any conversation, particularly conversations around sensitive or highly charged topics. Whether you either consciously or unconsciously change the subject at hand and imply or explain your own experiences comparatively, that is a micro-invalidation of that person's lived experience, because you have turned the focus toward you and or have compared your experiences, effectively shutting down or silencing the original complainant. You have now become the focal point of the conversation and silenced the voice of the original speaker. Black people versus white people report higher rates of racism and racial tensions. When white people do acknowledge racism, they tend to define it as isolated incidents rather than long-standing systemic problems with policies, laws, and institutions. This is also another example of micro-invalidation. So, how does all of this play out? Psychologist Dr. Robert Carter conceptualized the term racial trauma, which is also known as race-based traumatic stress. It is a set of consequences that occur when a person of color deals with racism and discrimination. It encapsulates the varied psychological, mental, and emotional harm that is caused by witnessing racism and discrimination and by experiencing it firsthand. Racial trauma may be individual to one person, or an entire community may experience it simultaneously. Studies show that negative experiences of racism can impact health in the form of comorbid and chronic health disparities, such as high blood pressure, heart disease, diabetes, low birth weight, depression, anxiety, sleeplessness, suicidality, frustration, and fears of helplessness. Studies show that Black people and other ethnic minorities believe that racism is an ongoing and persistent problem that impacts every realm of their lives. In contrast, most white people believe that racism is an experience of the past or that it is consistently getting better. Studies show, in fact, that racism and racist activity toward ethnic minorities has increased, not decreased, between 2010 and 2016. And also the subtleties in which racism is imposed or inflicted is increasing. In other words, people have gotten smarter and more covert in their racist language and actions. PTSD caused by racism or racial trauma is likely to be under-recognized due to the lack of awareness among clinicians, discomfort surrounding conversations about race in therapeutic settings, and a lack of validated measures for its assessment. So when racial microaggressions go out, there's a cycle that occurs. Psychological stress responses, behavioral stress responses, and physiological stress responses all manifest resulting from racial microaggressive incidents. All of this results in racial battle fatigue, a term coined by Dr. William Smith in 2003. Racial trauma and racial battle fatigue manifest similarly to PTSD symptoms: sleeplessness, fear, anger, hostility, fatigue, substance abuse, depression, violence. Additionally, Black and Asian people are disproportionate leaders of comorbid health maladies and diseases. So how much of this health disparity is caused by racism? At the moment, racial trauma is not diagnosable. Although racial trauma manifests similarly to PTSD, PTSD refers to a single incident, either witnessed in person, seen, or heard. Racial trauma occurs frequently, so there's no diagnosis, thereby making getting treatment specifically for racial trauma difficult. Excuse me. Finding a counselor who specializes in racial trauma is also challenging. Typically, psychotherapy is Eurocentrically based, meaning white counselors may not be equipped to work with a client who is suffering from racial trauma and may even find racial trauma difficult to identify due to the lack of knowledge and experience. So what do we do? There's a lot of talk about self-care and things that we should do to take care of ourselves. Oh, just take a mental health day. But what does that mean? Because when we come back from that mental health day, or we come back from running or walking or going to the shops or painting, we're still confronted with microaggressions that occur on a daily basis and how we deal with them. So at this point, I'd like to conclude my talk and open it up for questions and answers. And let's talk about the ways that people handle trauma and come up with some solutions, perhaps, on how we can move from here. I wanted to open this part up to discussion because I don't want to tell you what to do. I want you to think about what to do. It's not as easy because racism isn't going to go away. It's been here, it's going to be here. And if Black people could get rid of racism, I guarantee you we would have done it hundreds of years ago. So Sarah, I'm going to invite you back to open up the questions and answers.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that. I feel like we have got a lot to talk about here. Thank you so much, Dr. Norwood. So we've got quite a few questions in. First question has come from Zahra, and it's, does anybody have an example of the best way to confront that microaggression or make the person aware? Or, I mean, I would drop in with that as well. Is that confrontation something that can add into the racial battle fatigue? Are we putting our precious energy into something that ultimately?
Well, the thing is, we're all human, and so we're going to react to certain things whether we consciously do it or not. So if somebody is perpetuating a microaggression against you, your normal reaction is either fight or flight. And it depends on your personality. If you are not afraid of confrontation, you may perhaps call that person out on it. But if you don't, you will not necessarily confront them. And then keep in mind, that's going to add to the health disparity of, the anxiety, the depression. And this is what turns into comorbid diseases of high blood pressure and high cholesterol and heart disease and all these things. I think it's also subjective because it depends on the circumstance. If your boss or your line manager specifically commits a microaggression against you, how comfortable are you going to feel to confront your boss? I personally would do it, but that's just my personality, because there is a way to confront it as well. And I think but then, there's also the thing, why do I have to be the bigger person when I have had this done to me? So it really is just having an action plan. I encourage people to have a reaction ready, memorize it. If you feel, and let's face it, if we're brown people, we know what racism is. We know it. We just can't always act on it. So have a reaction practiced in your mind. If you feel that someone has committed a microaggressive event against you, have your answer ready for them. Have your action prepared.
Thank you for that. That really rings true with a couple of experiences that I've been thinking about recently. I'm going to drop my question in next, okay. Which was around, there's I think also the space in which you encounter that microaggression is really shapes the response. But I love that idea of having a practice, having a way that we can put some kind of barrier around our energy. I was thinking of specifically was the creative energy. I know a lot of creative people who go into spaces, Black and brown creative people, where they are ready to get their work done. They're ready to, shift into all kinds of requirements for their work. So we're talking about that, being able to focus on their art, focus on how they connect up the next part of their project or their work. And in those environments, when they get themselves into the right space, and it's almost like they're more vulnerable in those situations when come across a microaggression, and then that will take out at least a few hours of what just happened there. I don't feel good now. I'm not in that space. I've lost that grounding that I had ready for the creative process. So I guess my question was around that idea of having the action plan, having a practice. And have you heard of any particular ones that might inspire us a little bit on there?
Well, I can honestly say that, I don't care about running. I don't care about walking. So when people say go for a walk, it's like, unless I'm going somewhere, I'm not, I'm going to get in my car and I'm going to go. So, those things, the typical things that you hear about self-care, I love taking a hot bath. But the thing is, we usually, when we're doing these things, we're still thinking about what the aggression was. So I had to come up with a way to completely detach myself so I couldn't think of anything else. And one of the ways that I did, I thought for some reason, because, we're talking about history, from childhood. Well, what did I used to do when I was a kid that I really used to love? And I used to color. I loved coloring. So I took up adult coloring again. And I started playing jacks again. I don't know, do you have jacks here in the UK? Where it's, you throw out some jacks and you throw a ball up in the air and you pick the jack up before you catch the ball, whatever you call that here. So I actually went into my inner child and found things that made me happy as a kid. I also started venerating my ancestors because there's somebody in my bloodline who survived getting snatched off the shores of Africa, a country in Africa, survived the Middle Passage, survived chattel slavery, survived Jim Crow, all of that. So I could sit here and present this information to you. So I venerate my ancestors. I come from a very small family, but I feel like my ancestors aren't necessarily related to me all of the time. They're my elders and my spirit guides and my ascended masters. So I think veneration of the ancestors is another one, but also my research, from one of the findings was that Black women, and I would assume this is true for Asian women and any woman really, we find solace in other people who look like us and who experience the same things. So the Black women in my study found their strength and empowerment through other Black women. So what I would do is get into a safe space with a group of people and have like little focus groups, have role play. And, what if this is what happened to me? How would you react to that? How can I say this and still maintain my job? Things like that, just sounding off things off of each other, I would think would be really helpful.
Thank you so much. I am writing these down literally.
Go back and watch the tape instead.
As fast as you're saying it. I love that idea because I find so often that we meet with our friends, our kindreds, our
well, we have a tendency to meet each other and bitch and complain and moan about what's happened, but turn that around so that, okay, well, this happened. Now, what do I do?
What do I do?
Next time.
I love that. I love the role play element. I love that.
Own empowerment back. That empowers you and makes you active, proactive.
Absolutely. We have just had like about 5 a whole load of questions coming in ever so fast, so I am going to try and get through as many of them as possible. My apologies if we kind of repeat some of the areas. I'm going to try and bundle them together, but that's
I'm glad you're putting questions in the chat. That's great.
People are putting in their comments, their experiences. Okay, so let me pop up the next one here. We're getting so much interesting comments, people thanking you, validation of experiences. We've got a comment as well around fawn response as a thing, excessive people pleasing coming in there. Maybe it's not a theory I know.
I want to hang on that for a second. People pleasing.
Yep, no problem.
Because I mean, I don't care how old you are. I have a milestone birthday coming up. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but a lot of how we respond in life now is how is resultant of the experiences that we had as children.
Yes.
So one of the things that I did also was I went back and developed a relationship with my younger self. So I would do meditations and practices where I would go back and I would see little Carlette and I would see her suffering from whatever it was that she was suffering. And I would go and comfort her. I would literally visualize my adult self embracing my younger self and saying all of these affirmations to her and, giving her the support and perhaps in some cases love that she didn't get as a child, giving that to her as my adult self. Also, what really manifested from that kind of surprisingly was that when I was feeling sorry for myself as an adult or wallowing in my own misery, my younger self would appear to me and say, don't tell me that I got my what kicked back when you were a kid for you to sit there and cry like a baby now. So make everything that I went through worth it and suck it up, buttercup, and move on. And so I developed this relationship. People might call that schizophrenia, I don't know. But I developed this relationship with my child self and my adult self. And you would be amazed at how much healing I was able to do in that process.
I really feel you on that one. I think we are surprised sometimes how bold our child selves are, that the no nonsense attitude of your 4-year-old self sometimes. It's like, no, that's not right.
Yeah, well, that child was brave, or you wouldn't be where you are. That child endured whatever, and through bravery and resilience, got you to where you are. And so that child needs to be nurtured if it wasn't nurtured properly in real time.
Absolutely, absolutely. I have another one up here. Lots of people just really responding so positively about feeling validated by so much of the content here. We've got a question here from Patricia, which is having actions prepared. How can So I think we were talking about the helpful advice you've been giving here. So having actions prepared, but how can you deal with situations that have been ongoing for some time without damaging that? The phrase we've got here is standing amongst your peers. So there's kind of slow burn situations where you're quite conscious about how especially I suppose we're thinking work environment here, maybe.
Well, two things are going to happen. It's either going to manifest physically so that you're keeping all of that internalized, and that's not going to have a positive outcome, or you're going to eventually one day just explode, and that might not have a positive outcome either.
So it's with really we're
it depends on the circumstance. It depends on your personality, and it depends on if you have had enough. So if you are fearless and you are ready to accept whatever the outcome is that may happen, then go for it. Yeah. I mean, I know jobs are tough, and I know that, people have to eat and they have to, but you know what, at the bottom line, that we have one life to live. And I'm gonna tell you something, and this is very brutal, but so I chalk it up to the Americanism, okay? I have a tendency to say exactly what I think, but I'm gonna tell you, if something happens to you and you don't wake up one day and don't show up on that job, they're gonna put up a job description within 2 weeks to have they'll come and they'll tell your family they're sorry and they'll send you flowers. They may even show up for the funeral, but they are gonna fill your spot within a month. So you have to take that into consideration. Yeah. And how is all of that pressure manifesting in your life? How are you interacting with your partner? How are you interacting with your friends? How are you interacting with your children? If you find that you are a different person because of the stress that you're under on your job, then it might be time for you to do something completely different. And it doesn't even mean stay in the same line of work. Look, I packed up and moved from America to to the UK, you can't get any more drastic than that. You know, I had 5 suitcases, a 13-year-old, and $3,000. And here I am 7 years later. Sometimes you have to change your stars.
Yeah.
And go out there and do the unexpected.
That in itself, I feel like we should make that into a little clip. Maybe we should, that might be part of many people's practice at this point, like, you know, kind of centering their inner Dr. Carla Norwood. I found another question in amongst a lot of really beautiful comments, and we've got an actual question here from Nicola. How best to support children who are suffering racial trauma in the UK education system today, when head teachers will not accept that a child has experienced racism unless it's a blatant use of the N-word?
Oh gosh.
Yeah, really.
Okay, so listen, let me tell you, as a mother, I totally understand your situation. I empathize with your situation because my daughter was in secondary school when we came over here. So even though she didn't grow up here, she was 13 when we got here. And let me tell you, she would come home with those kids putting their fingers in her hair with, you know, microaggressive statements. And, you know, she would come home crying. She even developed PTSD of people approaching her because she thought they were going to touch her. Okay. And I went up to the school and they said, "Do you have an appointment?" I'm like, "No, no, I'm not. I'm here to talk to the principal." And fortunately, I had a head teacher, I think that's what you call them, right? A head teacher who was receiving of what I had to say. I said, because the next time somebody touches, I mean, one kid threatened her with a knife, and I thought, you know, the next time I come up here, it will be because you have called an assembly. Because if you don't want to stand up and tell these people that they cannot touch my daughter, then I will gladly do it myself. I'll just stand up there and tell them myself. But I know that that's not realistic for most people. And I know that it's so frustrating because I do work as a life coach mentor, and I am working with a grandmother whose grandchildren who are being tortured, literally abused racially at the school that they're in. But the racism is so insidious and so embedded in the education system. I wish I had an answer because it doesn't get better. It's on the university levels as well. You know, we survived going through racism in primary and secondary school, and then we go to university paying thousands of pounds for an education to be abused. So I wish I had an answer, but I just wanted you to know that as a mother, I'm very empathetic to that, and I understand it. And I really wish I could tell you what to do.
Thank you so much for that response, and thank you for your question, Nicola. It really, really,
it's tragic because as moms, we want to protect our children.
Absolutely.
And you can't call the police because they'll kick it back to the school, and I don't know, it's really a difficult position. And see, what happens is in some of my trainings, I give an example of these students are disproportionately what do you call it, removed from school, excluded, systematically excluded from school. So say for example, you have a Black child walking to school and somebody calls them the N-word on the way to school. He gets to school, that's still with him, and then he knows he's got a racist teacher, and so he becomes withdrawn or he acts out, and either one that he does can cause him to get excluded, either for not speaking or for speaking out of line, out of turn. So yeah, it's really a difficult position.
We have another question as well. This one is from Chantal. Chantal's asking, is it possible to overcome racial trauma, even if you've moved or found a place where people look like you, because you have suffered that heavy racism, that trauma that is from being in a place that's predominantly white?
Okay, so I'm not a clinician, and I'm very careful to make that clear that I'm not a clinician. So I don't want to to even speculate if you can get over racial trauma, because I don't know. And I wouldn't want to speak to that. But what I can tell you is I went to a country where I had a ball. I was there for 2 weeks and I just had the best time of my life. I felt relaxed, and I couldn't really put my finger on it. Why am I so happy? I had no stress, no anxiety, no anything, and got back to the airport in Miami, coming back from where I was, and laid eyes on the first blonde-haired, blue-eyed person that I had seen. And then it occurred to me that for the 2 weeks, I had seen nothing but people of color. I hadn't seen any white presence at all. And even subconsciously, that had done something to my body. Now, I don't want to be too graphic, but when we're talking about comorbid mortalities, I wanted to say that research shows that Black people, Asian people, people who suffer from racial trauma also typically or similarly may suffer from constipation. However, when they're on holiday or on vacation and relaxed and having a good time, find that they become regular. And that alone suggests how tightly we clench our bodies in everyday life trying to survive. We clench our bodies so much that our intestines are not able to function properly to pass bowel. So I think that's fascinating. So there is something to that. And if you can remove yourself and surround yourself where you it's eye candy for you, that is soothing, then I do think that is, and it comes more than just watching programs on television. You have to totally immerse yourself into that environment.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
I see somebody says holiday bowel freedom is real.
Sure.
That's exact. Thank you for the validation, because
yes,
that's true.
Okay, so I'm going to go up from that one, and we've got a question from Françoise. Do you have recommendations for children's books available to help prepare our children to navigate this topic and to stop the intergenerational trauma and current trauma that they are probably facing? So that's from Françoise.
One of the most helpful books that I had, there are children's books, and of course you asked me on the spot, so I'm not going to think of one of them. But so you want to talk about race. And I see her name. It starts Ijeoma. So you want to talk about race is the name of the book, and I found that extremely helpful. And it's on a level of that's very comprehensive. It's not highbrow. It's very comprehensive. I would also encourage people to read up on post-traumatic slave syndrome. I had considered mentioning that in tonight's talk, but there's just so much to say about that. Dr. Joy Leary is the author of post-traumatic slave syndrome. That will also give you tremendous insight on how we manifest past trauma and how we deal from the residual effects of racism in our contemporary lives. It's learned behavior from slavery that we carry with us, sometimes unbeknownst. And she gives amazing examples.
Thank you for that. I've made a little note. We will try and collect some of these, and also maybe some of the references that we've come up with that you've mentioned during your talk as well. And we'll circulate those when we circulate our messages and our details about the next session that we run as well.
Okay.
So we also have up here, so this question again from Chantal, I think, from Chantal. Do you think there's a reason why so many microaggressions and racism in the UK? Do you think that the reason, or I guess one of the reasons, that there are so many microaggressions and insidious racism in the UK And it's this way because Black people are portrayed in the educational system. Sorry, I have mangled this question. My apologies, Chantal. Do you think that the reason why there are so many microaggressions and racism in the UK is because the way that Black people are portrayed in the education system in books such as Of Mice and Men, which mean people grow up with, or I guess we're thinking.
I certainly think that plays a big part of it, but it's by far, it's because, you know, it's very, very covert. And I think that they think that we don't know what's going on. You know, the minority population in this country of brown people is only 8%. You know, 5% of them are Asian, 3% are Black. So you're talking about 3 million people. There are 1 million people in the greater London area, Black people. There are about 800,000 in Birmingham. And then the other remaining percentage is scattered throughout the entire UK. So, you know, that's very small numbers. And so this is why I think that some things go undetected, or, you know, there's a very strong pushback to change. And because the numbers just simply aren't there, it's very easy for them to do that. But I also think that I was going to say something else, Chantel, and speak to. I think that there are many, 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 many reasons. I mean, Agatha Christie, her first, what was it? One of her books was 10 Little Ends. I mean, you know, it's just ingrained and embedded in the culture. And this is one of the main reasons why I stayed here in the UK. I'm going to be honest with you. You need more boots on the ground, so I'm here to fight with you guys.
We love having you here, obviously, please stay. Okay, so yeah, so we've done Nicola's question. I'm just want to check that there's like one or two more that maybe I've missed on here, and I'm just gonna have a quick scroll through. Okay. So I also just want to say to everyone at this stage that we will be sending out a recording of this amazing session that we're running today to all of you who've signed up and people who are enjoying it here. Okay. So here we are, a comment from Bianca. I think it's important as healing our trauma. I think as important as healing our trauma is rethinking what whiteness is doing to heal their racism.
Oh, that will be my next PhD. Thank you for saying that, because if we accept that racial trauma is handled down intergenerationally, then it's only fair that we talk about how their need to dominate and oppress is handed down intergenerationally. Because ever since I was a kid, I've heard, oh, well, it'll get better with the next generation. But no, that's not considering that the racists today are raising future racists. You know, that's giving them the benefit of the doubt. And it absolutely does not matter if there are more brown people on this planet until the economics shift, until there is a shift of economic power, then racism will never go away, because the small few that own the money and wealth and resources are going to continue to make money on the backs of those who don't. And so, yeah, it's a matter of there having to be a complete paradigm shift in the way that things are right now.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I have one last question, which I'm sorry, my apologies to Claire. This question was I missed it the first time, so she's popped it in a couple more times. Is Dr. Norwood's thesis available for us to read?
It is, but it's not on the University of Birmingham website yet. So, and I'm trying to figure out why.
So
trying to figure out why it's not there.
I can chime in a little bit here as a librarian.
But in the meantime, you know, you can find me on LinkedIn. Please, you know, connect with me there. I I'm so over social media. I still have profiles out there, but I really don't even engage that much anymore. But I do like keeping up my LinkedIn profile. So if you'd like to connect me there, as soon as it's listed on the Birmingham website, I will let you know.
Definitely. I will also say that every PhD that is published, or every PhD that is awarded in the UK or Britain, or I don't know what the full thing is, in the UK, is available on a service at the British Library called Ethos. So yeah, even if it's not quite downloaded onto the repository at University of Birmingham, you should be able to find Dr. Colette Norwood's thesis on the British Library. I think the site is a little bit not quite working at the moment. I think they had a big hack earlier on in the week, but once that's up and running, it should be okay.
I'd just like to say one last thing before we go is to everyone that is still engaged in the webinar. Thank you for sticking it out and staying here with me. Thank you for the support and positive comments in the chat. I can't wait to go through the comments later, but I also want you to know that you are not alone. And sometimes there's comfort in just simply knowing that somebody understands and acknowledges what you are going through. And together, then we will find a way to address that and hopefully start the healing process. I hope that I've given you some suggestions today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Colette Norwood, for such I want to say interesting, but I want to say such a personal and absolutely really touching, really discursive and very educational talk for all of us. So on behalf of the Black History Year Steering Group, I'd like to also thank everybody on the call today for joining us, for bringing the amazing comments, the personal testimonies in there, and really making an online community for this short amount of time. I feel like we've started working on one of those principles together here today. Our next event will take place in February, so we will be in contact with our further details next month. You will also be sent a link to this video and any other information that we've mentioned that we will send. We will do that. Thank you all very much, and goodbye. Good night.